Hey everyone, how's it going? Long time no see. I have not made a video on BookTube for some time. I have been extremely busy lately, and I also was feeling like I needed something of a break from making BookTube videos. I just felt slightly burnt out. I was rather productive for the first third of the year, so I think I also needed a break, but I think the primary reason that I haven't been making BookTube videos is because I've been teaching this summer. I am teaching a summer course, which tend to be very intense, and it's also my first time teaching ever. So that tends to be very intense. That's what everyone tells me, is that teaching for the first time is just really overwhelming and a lot of work, because you're getting your mind around the material, you're wrapping your head around teaching for the first time, and it's a summer course, so it's only 8 weeks, so it's intense. And thankfully, I only have to teach 4 of the weeks, so I have a partner that I'm teaching it with, and I volunteered to teach the first 4 weeks. She will teach the second 4 weeks. So I don't actually have even that much longer left to teach, so hopefully I will be back to regular BookTube videos soon. But I thought that I would try to drop in and do a little mid-year kind of check-in kind of video, you know, looking back on my reading for the first half of the year, because I love watching these kinds of videos. I think they're so much fun, they're so interesting. The way different people kind of evaluate their reading for the first half of the year, I think, is extremely interesting. And my own criteria in that regard are not very sophisticated. I take a very intuitive, broad, vague approach of just what books have been good, basically, is how I evaluate it. And I think it has been a good reading year in terms of the quality of the books I've been reading. But it has been less good on the quantity. So I have read 43 books this year, and I realize that when you take the entire human population into account, that's like a ton, but when you take BookTube into account, that's tiny. And even when you look at my own history with reading, I think that's a little on the low side by this point in the year. You know, I average about 100 books per year, and so we're about halfway through the year and I'm just under 50. So that suggests that I am slightly behind. And, you know, Goodreads has that really annoying feature where when you set your Goodreads goal, it'll tell you, like, whether you're on track based on the time in the year, based on how many books you've read. And according to that, I am 5 books behind. Of course, I find that actually rather annoying. That's one of the things that I don't like about Goodreads. Actually, a lot of things that I like about Goodreads, unlike some people on BookTube, but we won't get into that. But that is one thing that I find rather annoying, that Goodreads does that, because it's just like, okay, just leave me alone, let me live my life, I will read as many books as I please. But anyway, I feel like I am a little bit behind, a little bit slow this year, and that number of 43 is decent, but it also, I think, is a little bit inflated. And the reason that I think it's kind of inflated is twofold. For one thing, the first 2 books that I finished this year were respectively Middlemarch and David Copperfield, both of which are gigantic, both 800 plus page books, but both of which I read mostly in 2020, not 2021. And so they don't really feel like 2021 books, even though they were added to my 2021 reading challenge, and so they sort of count towards my count for this year's reading. But they don't feel like they count to me because I think of them as 2020 books. And so I'm not including them in this video, even though, like, theoretically they sort of count. And I think that my number is also slightly inflated by the fact that I have read more slim volumes of poetry this year than any other year before. No, I like reading poetry. I read a lot of poetry, but I tend to read it out of anthologies or collected poems by a poet that I like in particular, and I don't tend to read as much slim volumes of poetry, because that tends to be new releases, that tends to be contemporary poetry. And I'm not a huge reader of contemporary poetry, or at least I haven't been in the past. But I'm trying to fix that this year. I'm trying to read more contemporary, or as I might like to say, contemporary poetry. And the reason I put scare quotes around it is because a lot of the contemporary poetry that I have read has been by poets who are, like, in their 70s or 80s, or who are dead by, like, 15 years. So it's not contemporary poetry in the sense that they're all, like, living poets. But it's contemporary poetry in the sense that it's not T.S. Eliot, you know? It's not T.S. Eliot or earlier or something like that. It's, you know, authors who are, like, relatively within the sphere of the modern world, not modern world as in the historical sense, but just modern as in, like, vaguely late 20th, early 21st century literature. And I think that that's inflated the number because those tend to be very short. You can read them in like a week, and you can kind of squeeze them in between other books, you know what I mean? And so I feel like 43 is actually a little bit inflated this year. And so I do feel a little bit behind with the number of books I've been reading. And I think that the reason I'm maybe a little bit behind is because I have acquired a number of new interests. You know, I've been getting really into film last year and even more so this year, and so that's been occupying a lot of my time on the weekends. I've also gotten more into music, again, in the past year and in this year, and that's great, like, that's awesome, but it, again, takes time away from reading, and sometimes I play music now while I read sometimes, and that slows down my reading, and as you all know, I'm already a very slow reader anyway, so to be a slow reader in general, and then to put music listening on top of that to make it even more slow is like the recipe of for death. So anyway, yeah, they're a good number. And then I've been busy in school and work. You know, I feel like my graduate studies have gotten a lot busier this year. I think I just have more projects going on than ever, and I've started to teach right now, and so on and so forth. So I've just had a lot going on, and so I think that's why. So I'm not saying this as like a mea culpa sort of thing, like I'm ashamed of not having read as much as I would like. I'm just making an observation about my year that I think it has been a bit of a slower reading year for me. But on top of all that, I'll add one more reason why I think maybe this year has been a bit slower of a reading year than past years. And that's because I think I'm realizing that I need to do less pushing myself to read more. You know, and I think when you join BookTube, you kind of feel the pressure to read more. And so I think for a few years, I was in this state of mind where I was like, okay, I need to make sure I push myself forward to finish this book or press on with the book. Whereas now I think I'm starting to realize that, okay, you know, read 20 pages a day of this book, because that's the amount you can read and process properly. Whereas if I were to push myself to read 30 or 40 or 50 pages a day, I might manage to get through it, but I might not process those 50 pages as well as I would hope. And so I'm doing less of the pushing myself to read more and spending more time reading and more focusing on the quality of the actual reading that I do. So I read a bit more slowly, even more slowly than usual, I suppose. So there's that as well, and I think that's a good thing. Again, this isn't a mea culpa routine that I'm ashamed or sad or anything. It's just observations. So anyway, so it's been a slower reading year, but I'm pretty happy with where my reading is at. You know, I've probably waffled on enough about the numbers in general. You know, a lot of other people do much more extensive numbers-based analyses of their reading. You know, they look at the gender of the authors of the books that they've read, the racial and ethnic background of the author that they've read, the books that they've read in translation. I don't do that so much, not because I don't think those things are important, but just because I am too lazy to do that sort of thing. So I will not do that. But anyway, now that I've waffled on for almost 10 minutes about all this irrelevant stuff, I will talk about some of the best books that I've read this year, or at least some of the most interesting books. You know, I'm starting to realize for myself as a book consumer and as a art consumer in general of like film and music is that I don't tend to dislike things that often. I tend to either find it interesting, which is sort of the middle point. Like, I found it interesting, didn't love it, didn't hate it, but there were some things of value that I got from it. Or I tend to like it, or I tend to love it. And if it's not any of those things, then it's just that I'm sort of indifferent towards it. But then occasionally there will come along some book that really kind of just does piss me off for whatever reason or another. But anyway, so these are books that I have either loved or found extremely, extremely interesting. And I thought that I would begin with some fiction books, because that's the genre that BookTube, for some reason, is so fixated on, so I will start with that. So the first book that I have listed here is As I Lay Dying by William Faulkner, which is probably his most accessible work, so I've heard. It's the first Faulkner I've ever read, and it left a very good impression. I loved a lot of the writing. It was really a book kind of after my own heart, you know, very allusive, you know, to the classics, very ambitious in its themes, very psychological. It really delves deeply into the minds of the characters, and it's this sort of dark, gritty family drama, all surrounding the burial of the mother of this family who's just died. And I thought that it was so psychologically intelligent and eloquent and full of layers despite its brief length. It's, I think, not even 300 pages. It's one of those books where the difficulty in reading it doesn't come so much from the density of the text itself, so much as it comes from all the white space around the text, all the stuff that just goes unsaid in the book. And that made it a really interesting challenge. Because I'm used to tackling books that are difficult and dense, but I'm not so used to reading books where the difficulty comes from all the white space around the text. So that was a great book. And then Roadside Picnic by Boris and Arkady Strugatsky. So this is the first entry that kind of speaks to a growing theme in my reading, which is that I am really starting to pick up more of an interest in especially science fiction, but also fantasy to a degree. And that's not to say that I read a ton of science fiction and fantasy this year yet. I have some that I would like to get to before the end of the year, or at least sometime soon. But this is a science fiction novel, and it takes place actually roughly in the contemporary time, at least when it was written. It was written, I think, in the 70s or 80s, and so it actually does roughly take place in the contemporary world, where this thing called the Visiting has happened, where some extraterrestrial intelligence sort of beamed this thing down on Earth, and no one really knows what they were doing when they did it, but they shot something at Earth, and it landed in a few places, and it created these places called the zones, which are really dangerous to enter, and where all these weird things happen, and where it's really difficult for humans to survive. And there are these people in this sort of futuristic world called stalkers who will guide lay people into the zones if they want it. And they also go into the zones to find interesting artifacts that they can sell. And it's a really interesting novel. It's also most famously the basis for the Andrei Tarkovsky film Stalker, which I just absolutely adore. And it is really enigmatic. I'm not quite sure what to make of it, but it was so interesting and had such interesting characters, and I think is working on some extremely profound themes about how people construct meaning in the universe that I wanted to include it. And the next book after that is also science fiction. This is The Lathe of Heaven by Ursula K. Le Guin. And this is about a man named Orr. His last name is Orr. George Orr, that's his name. He has dreams at night that come true. So his dreams change the real world. He will have a dream, and he will wake up, and whatever happened in his dream has happened in the real world. And for everyone else in the world, that has been the reality forever. So no one in the real world realizes that George Orr's dreams are changing the real world, but they do, and he realizes it. And he starts to work through this therapist named Haber. I can't remember his first name, but Haber is his last name. This psychiatrist named Haber, who tries to start manipulating Orr's dreams to his own ends, in a way. And that's sort of where the story takes off. And it's so interesting. It's a short little thing. You can read it in a week, or if you're a faster reader than me, in probably a weekend. And it's jam-packed with so many interesting ideas and themes, despite its brief length. And there's so much beautiful writing in it as well. Ursula Le Guin is certainly a versatile writer. The only other books I've read by her are two of the novels from her Earthsea series, which are, YA fantasy, right? And in a completely different kind of register. And so that was, I think, just the tip of the iceberg in terms of her versatility as an author. And this was just a fantastic novel, so I recommend. But next up is Njal Saga, which is by an anonymous author. This is a 13th century Icelandic saga that is sort of a family saga about a cycle of revenge that continues over the course of many decades, almost a century, I think. And it is such a powerful piece of work about a man named Njal, whose family members are a part of this cycle of revenge. And it is such a powerful and I think thought-provoking piece of work. It does unfortunately end with a whimper instead of a bang, and that is rather unfortunate, but I think that that's totally worth it because it is jam-packed with psychological insights into human nature, fantastic action set pieces, which is not the kind of thing that I tend to really look for in my literature, but it has so many fantastic action set pieces that are just thrilling to read and to just sort of revel in the craft of the author, whoever the author was. We don't know who they were. It is a fantastic piece of work. You know, a character in this book will come along and will only be in the story for like 2 to 5 pages, and yet they will feel completely rounded and three-dimensional, and that is just fantastic. So I recommend this highly. This might be my favorite kind of fiction work, even though this is the only entry in this section of this video that's really not actually a work of fiction, because it's not a novel, really. It's based on historical events, and probably sort of mythologized, changed a little bit, but it's also not a conventional novel, just stylistically. It's written in prose, but it's not really stylistically what we think of as a modern novel, but this is probably my favorite sort of made-up story, as I might say, of the year so far. And then lastly, the only book that I can say really rivals Njal Saga is At Play in the Fields of the Lord by Peter Matheson, which is his novel about that centers on 2 men, one of whom is named Louis Moon, and who is a half Native American man who has traveled to South America to exterminate the Nyaruna people in the Amazon for sort of it's not explained, but for the sake of sort of development of their land, basically, so that gold can be mined and so on. And then another man whose name escapes me at the moment, who is there to convert the Nyaruna to Christianity. And the sort of conflict that develops between those 2 approaches to these indigenous peoples. And it is such a great novel. It's full of just fantastic prose, just fantastic. I like to describe the prose as angular. I'm not sure what makes me say that, but it seems like very angular prose, very kind of pointed and sharp, you know, with just absolutely beautiful imagery in it as well. But also this novel has some of the best dialogue that I've read in a long time. Just some great, like, zingers, great one-liners in the dialogue. And the dialogue is often centered on these sort of really profound theological questions, you know, about faith, about unbelief and belief and conversion as well, which is certainly an interesting topic. And missionary work as well is obviously a big theme in this book, and that's something that I could probably make a whole video about my opinions of. But anyway, it's such a great novel, and I think it's probably almost more relevant nowadays than it was when it was written, which I think was in 1965. And to say the least, it was relevant at the time, but I think it's even more relevant now, because, you know, it's these themes of colonialism, of cultural genocide, of genocide in general, and identity, and religious faith, and fundamentalism to a degree, and it's just such an interesting novel. There's so many different angles to take from it, and it was also adapted into a wonderful film of the same title, directed by Hector Babenco, which I also watched, and which I also thought was fantastic. I didn't like it quite as much, but it is fantastic. Hard to come by, though, but fantastic, with a brilliant soundtrack by Zbigniew Preisner. So anyway, I will end the fiction section of the video, and now we'll progress into nonfiction. This is going to be a long video, I'm sorry. But, nonfiction, it has been a very strong year in nonfiction, and I think there's less slim pickings in the nonfiction, because I just tend to read more nonfiction than fiction. You know, I am still in the minority on BookTube, I think, in that most of what I read is nonfiction, and so it tends to be a more interesting conversation to talk about the best nonfiction that I've read than the best fiction. Although I like to think that the novels I've talked about have been quite good. But anyway, I will get into the nonfiction, and the first title that I have written down here is The Lives of the Great Composers by Harold Schonberg, which is basically really a history of Western classical music, right from Monteverdi all the way up to some modern composers like Philip Glass. And he discusses the lives and the works of most of the most notable composers from the Western tradition that you could name. And he does it so eloquently. He makes you want to go seek out their music, in addition to wanting to make you learn more about these people, many of whom were just endlessly fascinating human beings, because artists are just the weirdest people in the world. But this is such a great book. It's so quotable and just fantastic. I think it's a great introduction to Western music, because it approaches it through the lives of the individual composers, and it's wonderful. So I've raved about it many times. I sort of went through the book in my Sunday Miscellanies, back when I did Sunday Miscellanies, and so I probably don't need to rave about it too much, but it's just wonderful. The second book I have here is Are Prisons Obsolete by Angela Davis, which has one of those great titles that basically describes what the book is about. You know, it is just a really thorough demolition job on the American prison system, you know, on how it treats Black people in particular, but also Native Americans, Latin Americans, certain Asian American communities, and white people suffer from it as well, not to as great a degree, certainly, but they do as well. And she just gives this really thorough indictment of this system that was basically built to perpetuate the slavery of Black people, essentially, is what is the beginning point of this book. And I think it's so incredible how Angela Davis manages to do what she sets out to do so thoroughly in a book that is, I think, just barely 100 pages long. It really is a tremendous piece. And it seems like a good companion piece to the more famous book, The New Jim Crow, by Margaret Mitchell, which I don't think I got the authors of that book's name right. But a good companion piece to that. I haven't read that, but I do want to read it. But this seems like a good sort of condensed version of that. But anyway. The next book that I have written down is The Story of Art by E.H. Gombridge, which is kind of the lives of the great composers, but about painters and sculptors and other visual artists. And so this book is from 1950, but the prose feels so incredibly fresh. It's just so eloquent and insightful on every page about all of the artworks that E.H. Gombridge discusses. He made me want to learn more about art, made me want to acquire art pieces of my own, made me want to read about the artists and the artists' work. You know, at times this book really blew my mind, actually. Just opened my whole world to ideas that I had never even thought of before about art, you know. And it was just a pleasure. You know, E.H. Gombridge is just a pleasure to be with on the page, really, as he talks about these various artworks. And this is a great book. If you're interested in art, Western art, there's a focus on Western art, of course. If you're interested in Western art, this is a great, I think, introduction. Next up on my list is My Bright Abyss, Meditation of a Modern Believer by Christian Wyman, which is really a collection of memoiristic essays about Christian Wyman's own religious faith, as it tends to be filtered through poetry in particular, but also through his diagnosis with an incurable cancer. And it is such a great book, such an eloquent book, so many fantastic, insightful passages. You know, it was one of those books where almost every sentence I felt like I had to stop and digest it a little bit. You know, it almost felt like I couldn't read the book slowly enough, because it's just so dense with insights. You know, it's not dense in terms of the difficulty of the comprehension of the prose by any means. It's just dense with so many interesting and subtle insights into religious faith and into what it means to be a human being, and into poetry as well, and as religion tends to be discussed through poetry. And it's a fantastic nonfiction book. It's very slim. I highly recommend it. Then I only have two more to talk about, don't worry, but they're both works of history, interestingly, which is great. So the first one is 1493, Uncovering the World Columbus Created, I think that's the subtitle, by Charles Mann. And this is sort of kind of a sequel to his earlier book, his earlier more famous book, 1491, Uncovering the Americas Before Columbus, I believe is the subtitle of that one, where he talks about what the Americas were like before Columbus came, and sort of deconstructs a lot of these stereotypes that we have about what the Americas were like before Europeans came. You know, this idea that it was this like half-empty wilderness. He thoroughly deconstructs that stereotype about the Americas and shows that it was a lot more heavily populated than we thought, that civilizations there were a lot more sophisticated than was assumed for a long time, and so on and so forth. But 1493 is the other end of that, is what happened after Europeans discovered the Americas. How did that change the world? And it turns out in a lot of really terrible ways. This book, I think, is not as paradigm shifting or as mind-blowing as 1491. It is just as well written as 1491, certainly. Charles Mann has a great prose style. His words are very easy to read, but it's not quite as paradigm shifting, not quite as mind-blowing, but it is a really thorough and interesting introduction, I think, to colonialism and the evils that colonialism has brought upon people and the environment. And for that, I think it's great. It's a lot longer than 1491. I think it's almost 100 pages longer. And at times it feels like it's a little bit too detailed for its own good. It feels like there were a few different books that could have been extracted from this book, but it is such a good introduction to colonialism and what it has done to non-white people that I can definitely recommend it. And it is a great reading experience, despite the fact that sometimes it gets a little bit too detailed. And it has... What's great about it, too, is that it is very omnivorous. 1491 was like this, too. It's very omnivorous. There's obviously history, plenty of history, but there's also economics, there's ecology, there's sociology, there's history of race relations, cultural history. All sorts of things are covered in this book, and they're all really fascinating. And any one of them you could go down as a rabbit hole. So, 1493 I can recommend. And then the last book that I'm going to talk about in my nonfiction piece is This Hallowed Ground by Bruce Catton, which I just finished today. This is Bruce Catton's history of the Civil War, specifically the Civil War from the Union side, from the Union perspective. And it is a great, great work of narrative history. It's 400 pages long, so it's not short, but it's not super long. So it's a really accessible introduction to Civil War history, I think. But what I think really makes it a great book is that Bruce Catton is just so eloquent. I underlined so much in the book, and I dog-eared pages, and in addition to being eloquent, Bruce Catton is just at heart a storyteller. He's kind of someone you could see sitting around a campfire telling stories from his past or from history or whatever, and just being great at it. And you totally get that from this book. But also, Bruce Catton is just so wise. He just has so many great insights into American history and the American character. And what's great, too, I think, especially when you're talking about a subject like the Civil War, is that he is really, really good on race relations in the United States. He has some outdated terminology, because the book was published in 1956, but he is really intelligent on the subject of race relations, on what sort of racial and social and economic currents were working during the Civil War. So it's fantastic as military history, but it's fantastic, I think, as just like social history as well. So this is just a fantastic, fantastic book. I tend to have a recency bias in my praise of books, so like when I've just finished a great book is when I tend to give it the highest praise. But this might be the best book that I've read this year so far. I'm not quite sure, but that might be true. So anyway, I also wanted to give a shout out to 3 slim volumes of poetry that I've read this year that I thought were particularly good. And I'm not good at reviewing slim volumes of poetry because I'm just not good at talking about poetry in general. But the 3 that I wrote down as standouts among those that I've read are IRL by Tommy Pico, his kind of narrative poem about relationships, about life in the internet age, about relationships in the internet age, and about his life as an indigenous gay man. And it blew my mind. It had just some fantastic, fantastic lines. I need to reread it, though. I probably should buy my own copy that I can have and just reread. I read it from the library, but this was a fantastic narrative poem, and it was great. The other one was American Smooth by Rita Dove, which is full of some poems that are rather conventional by previous standards, some that are more formally innovative, but all of which are incredibly eloquent and really, really just really eloquent on the subject of the role of art in life, but also on the subject of racism and the experience of black people in America, and it's a fantastic collection. And then the last one I have here is Don't Call Us Dead by Danez Smith, which deals a lot with Danez Smith's own sort of experience as a gay person, non-binary person with AIDS, and is just an incredibly powerful, incredibly eloquent discussion, again, of kind of oppression and just his experience as a black, gay, non-binary person in the United States, and it just has so many fantastic lines in it. So it is an incredibly eloquent book. I'm not doing a good job of articulating why I liked it, but I would name Don't Call Us Dead as the best volume of poetry that I've read. So anyway, that is all I will talk about, I think. Long video, but you haven't seen me in a while, so hopefully that doesn't put you off. So I will leave it at that. Let me know if you've read any of these books, if you like any of them, or want to read any of them. And I will let you all go and talk to you later. Well, who knows when I'll make a video next, but anyway, I will talk to you at some point. I'm not leaving BookTube anytime soon, so anyway, bye guys.